Now he was all in his black gear, the massive breastplate, the padded jerkin, the long greaves, the mail gauntlets. At his side was a 5-foot broadsword, which, it was said, had belonged to a human hero called Audiobook. Resting on the deck against the golden rail of the bridge was the great round war-board, his shield, bearing the sign of the swooping dragon. And a helm was on his head, a black helm, with a dragon's head craning over the peak, and dragon's wings flaring backward above it, and a dragon's tail curling down the back. All the helm was black, but within the helm there was a white shadow, from which glared 2 crimson orbs, and from the sides of the helm strayed wisps of milk-white hair, almost like smoke escaping from a burning building. And as the helm turned, in what little light came from the lantern hanging at the base of the mainmast, the white shadow sharpened to reveal features, fine, handsome features, a straight nose, curved lips, upslanting eyes. The face of Emperor Elric of Melniboné peered into the gloom of the maze as he listened for the first sounds of the sea raiders' approach. He stood on the high bridge of the great golden battle barge, which, like all its kind, resembled a floating ziggurat equipped with masts and sails and oars and catapults. The ship was called the Son of the Pra, and it was the flagship of the fleet. The Grand Admiral Macum Colim stood beside Elric. Like Divim Tavar, the Admiral was one of Elric's few close friends. He had known Elric all his life, and had encouraged him to learn all he could concerning the running of fighting ships and fighting fleets. Privately, Macum Colim might fear that Elric was too scholarly and introspective to rule Melniboné, but he accepted Elric's right to rule, and was made angry and impatient by the talk of the likes of Irkun. Prince Irkun was also aboard the flagship, though at this moment he was below, inspecting the war engines. The Son of the Pra lay at anchor in a huge grotto, one of hundreds built into the walls of the maze when the maze itself was built, and designed for just this purpose, to hide a battle barge. There was just enough height for the masts, and enough width for the oars to move freely. Each of the golden battle barges was equipped with banks of oars, each bank containing between 20 and 30 oars on either side. The banks were 4, 5, or 6 decks high, and, as in the case of the Son of Pra, might have 3 independent steering systems, fore and aft. Being armored all in gold, the ships were virtually indestructible, and, for all their massive size, they could move swiftly and maneuver delicately when occasion demanded. It was not the first time they'd waited for their enemies in these grottos. It would not be the last, though when next they waited it would be in greatly different circumstances. The battle barges of Melniboné were rarely seen on the open seas these days, but once they had sailed the oceans of the world like fearsome floating mountains of gold, and they had brought terror whenever they were sighted. The fleet had been larger then, comprising hundreds of craft. Now there were less than 40 ships, but 40 would suffice. Now, in damp darkness, they awaited their enemies. Listening to the hollow slap of the water against the sides of the ship, Elric wished that he'd been able to conceive a better plan than this. He was sure that this one would work, but he regretted the waste of lives, both Melnibonéan and barbarian. It would have been better if some way could have been devised of frightening the barbarians away rather than trapping them in the sea maze. The Southlander fleet was not the first to have been attracted by Imrir's fabulous wealth. The Southlander crews were not the first to entertain the belief that the Melnibonéans, because they never now ventured far from the dreaming city, had become decadent and unable to defend their treasures, and so the Southlanders must be destroyed. In order to make the lesson clear, Melniboné was still strong. She was strong enough, in Irkun's view, to resume her former dominance of the world, strong in sorcery, if not in soldiery.
"Hist!"
Admiral Macum Colim craned forward.
"Was that the sound of an oar?"
Elric nodded. "I think so." Now they heard regular splashes, as rows of oars dipping in and out of the water, and they heard the creak of timbers. The Southlanders were coming. The Son of the PRA was the ship nearest to the entrance, and it would be the first to move out, but only when the last of the Southlanders' ships had passed them. Admiral Mahkum Kolim bent and extinguished the lantern. Then quickly, quietly, he descended to inform his crew of the raiders' coming. Not long before, Irkun had used his sorcery to summon a peculiar mist, which hid the golden barges from view, but through which those on the Melnibonéan ships could peer. Now Elric saw torches burning in the channel ahead, as carefully the reavers negotiated the maze. Within the space of a few minutes, 10 of the galleys had passed the grotto. Admiral Mahkum Kolim rejoined Elric on the bridge, and now Prince Irkun was with him. Irkun, too, wore a dragon helm, though less magnificent than Elric's, for Elric was chief of the few surviving dragon princes of Melniboné. Irkun was grinning through the gloom, and his eyes gleamed in anticipation of the bloodletting to come. Elric wished that Prince Irkun had chosen another ship than his, but it was Irkun's right to be aboard the flagship, and he could not deny it. Now half the 100 vessels had gone past. Irkun's armor creaked as impatiently he waited, pacing the bridge, his gauntleted hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "Soon," he kept saying to himself. "Soon." And then their anchor was groaning upwards, and their oars were plunging into the water as the last Southland ship went by, and they shot from the grotto into the channel, ramming the enemy galley amidships and smashing it in two. A great yell went up from the barbarian crew. Men were flung in all directions. Torches danced erratically on the remains of the deck as men tried to save themselves from slipping into the dark, chill waters of the channel. A few brave spears rattled against the sides of the Melnibonéan flag galley as it began to turn among the debris it had created. But Imririan archers returned the shots, and the few survivors went down. The sound of this swift conflict was the signal to the other battle barges. In perfect order they came from both sides of the high rock walls, and it must have seemed to the astonished barbarians that the great golden ships had actually emerged from solid stone. Ghost ships filled with demons who rained spears, arrows, and brands upon them. Now the whole of the twisting channel was confusion, and a medley of war shouts echoed and boomed, and the clash of steel upon steel was like the savage hissing of some monstrous snake. And the raiding fleet itself resembled a snake, which had been broken into 100 pieces by the tall, implacable golden ships of Melniboné. These ships seemed almost serene as they moved among their enemies, their grappling irons flashing out to catch wooden decks and rails and draw the galleys nearer so they might be destroyed. But the Southlanders were brave, and they kept their heads after their initial astonishment. 3 of the galleys headed directly for the Son of the PRA, recognizing it as the flagship. Fire arrows sailed high and dropped down onto the decks, which were wooden and not protected by the golden armor, starting fires wherever they fell, or else bringing blazing death to the men they struck. Elric raised his shield above his head, and 2 arrows struck it, bouncing, still flaring, to a lower deck. He leapt over the rail, following the arrows, jumping down to the widest and most exposed deck, where his warriors were grouping, ready to deal with the attacking galleys. Catapults thudded, and balls of blue fire swished through the blackness, narrowly missing all 3 galleys. Another volley followed, and one mass of flame struck the far galley's mast and then burst upon the deck, scattering huge flames wherever it touched. Grapples snaked out and seized the first galley, dragging it close, and Elric was among the first to leap down onto the deck, rushing forward to where he saw the Southland captain, dressed all in crude, checkered armor, a checkered surcoat over that, a big sword in both his huge hands, bellowing at his men to resist the Melnibonéan dogs. As Elric approached the bridge, 3 barbarians armed with curved swords and small oblong shields ran at him. Their faces were full of fear, but there was determination there as well, as if they knew they must die, but planned to wreak as much destruction as they could before their souls were taken. Shifting his war-board onto his arm, Elric took his own broadsword in both hands and charged the sailors, knocking one off his feet with the lip of the shield and smashing the collarbone of another. The remaining barbarian skipped aside and thrust his curved sword at Elric's face. Elric barely escaped the thrust, and the sharp edge of the sword grazed his cheek, bringing out a drop or two of blood. Elric swung the broadsword like a scythe, and it bit deep into the barbarian's waist, almost cutting him in two. He struggled for a moment, unable to believe that he was dead, but then, as Elric yanked the sword free, he closed his eyes and dropped. The man who had been struck by Elric's shield was staggering to his feet as Elric whirled, saw him, and smashed the broadsword into his skull. Now the way to the bridge was clear. Elric began to climb the ladder, noting that the captain had seen him and was waiting for him at the top. Elric raised his shield to take the captain's first blow. Through all the noise, he thought he heard the man shouting at him, "Die, you white-faced demon, die! You have no place on this earth any longer!" Elric was almost diverted from defending himself by these words. They rang true to him. Perhaps he really had no place on earth. Perhaps that was why Melniboné was slowly collapsing, why fewer children were born every year, why the dragons themselves were no longer breeding. He let the captain strike another blow at the shield, then he reached under it and swung at the man's legs. But the captain had anticipated the move and jumped backwards. This, however, gave Elric time to run up the few remaining steps and stand on the deck, facing the captain. The man's face was almost as pale as Elric's. He was sweating, and he was panting, and his eyes had misery in them as well as wild fear. "You should leave us alone," Elric heard himself saying. "We offer you no harm, barbarian. When did Melniboné last sail against the young kingdoms? You offer us harm by your very presence, white face. There is your sorcery, there are your customs, and there is your arrogance. Is that why you came here? Was your attack motivated by disgust for us? Or would you help yourselves to our wealth? Admit it, Captain. Greed brought you to Melniboné. At least greed is an honest quality, an understandable one, but you creatures are not human. Worse, you're not gods, though you behave as if you were. Your day is over, and you must be wiped out, your city destroyed, your sorceries forgotten." Elric nodded. "Perhaps you were right, Captain." "I am right. Our holy men say so. Our seers predict your downfall. The Chaos Lords whom you serve will themselves bring about that downfall." The Chaos Lords no longer have any interest in the affairs of Melniboné. They took away their power nearly 1,000 years since. Elric watched the captain carefully, judging the distance between them. Perhaps that is why our own power waned, or perhaps we merely became tired of power. "Be that as it may," the captain said, wiping his sweating brow, "your time is over. You must be destroyed, once and for all." And then he groaned, for Elric's broadsword had come under his checkered breastplate and gone up through his stomach and into his lungs. One knee bent, one leg stretched behind him, Elric began to withdraw the long sword, looking up into the barbarian's face, which had now assumed an expression of reconciliation. "That was unfair, Whiteface. We had barely begun to talk, and you cut the conversation short. You are most skillful. May you writhe forever in the higher hell. Farewell." Elric hardly knew why, after the captain had fallen face down on the deck, he hacked twice at the neck until the head rolled off the body, rolled to the side of the bridge, and then was kicked over the side, so that it sank into the cold, deep water. And then Yurkun came up behind Elric, and he was grinning. "You fight fiercely and well, my lord, Emperor. That dead man was right." "Right?" Elric glared at his cousin. "Right?" "Aye, in his assessment of your prowess." And chuckling, Yurkun went to supervise his men, who were finishing off the few remaining raiders. Elric did not know why he had refused to hate Yurkun before, but now He did hate Irkun. At that moment he would gladly have slain him. It was as if Irkun had looked deeply into Elric's soul and expressed contempt for what he had seen there. Suddenly Elric was overwhelmed by an angry misery, and he wished with all his heart that he was not a Melnibonéan, that he was not an emperor, and that Irkun had never been born. Like haughty leviathans, the great golden battle barges swam through the wreckage of the Reaver fleet. A few ships burned and a few were still sinking, but most had sunk into the unplumbable depths of the channel. The burning ships sent strange shadows dancing against the dank walls of the sea caverns, as if the ghosts of the slain offered a last salute before departing to the sea depths, where, it was said, a Chaos King still ruled, crewing his eerie fleets with the souls of all who died in conflict upon the oceans of the world. Or perhaps they went to a gentler doom, serving Strasha, lord of the water elementals, who ruled the upper reaches of the sea. But a few had escaped. Somehow the Southland sailors had got past the massive battle barges, sailed back through the channel, and must even now have reached the open sea. This was reported to the flagship, where Elric, Macum Colim, and Prince Irkun now stood together again on the bridge, surveying the destruction they had wreaked.
"Then we must pursue them and finish them,"
said Irkun. He was sweating and his dark face glistened. His eyes were alight with fever.
"We must follow them."
Elric shrugged. He was weak. He had brought no extra drugs with him to replenish his strength. He wished to go back to Imrir and rest. He was tired of bloodletting, tired of Irkun, and tired most of all of himself. The hatred he felt for his cousin was draining him still further, and he hated the hatred. That was the worst part.
"No,"
he said. "Let them go."
"Let them go? Unpunished? Come now, my lord king, that is not our way."
Prince Irkun turned to the aging admiral.
"Is that our way, Admiral Macum Colim?"
Macum Colim shrugged. He too was tired, but privately he agreed with Prince Irkun. An enemy of Melniboné should be punished for daring to even think of attacking the dreaming city. Yet he said,
"The Emperor must decide."
"Let them go," said Elric again. He leant heavily against the rail. "Let them carry the news back to their own barbarian land. Let them say how the dragon princes defeated them. The news will spread. I believe we shall not be troubled by raiders again for some time."
"The young kingdoms are full of fools,"
Irkun replied.
"They will not believe the news. There will always be raiders. The best way to warn them will be to make sure that not one Southlander remains alive or uncaptured."
Elric drew a deep breath and tried to fight the faintness which threatened to overwhelm him.
"Prince Irkun, you are trying my patience." "But, my emperor, I think only of the good of Melniboné. Surely you do not want your people to say that you are weak, that you fear a fight with but 5 Southland galleys?"
This time Elric's anger brought him strength.
"Who will say that Elric is weak? Will it be you, Irkun?"
He knew that his next statement was senseless, but there was nothing he could do to stop it.
"Very well. Let us pursue these poor little boats and sink them, and let us make haste. I am weary of it all."
There was a mysterious light in Irkun's eyes as he turned away to relay the orders. The sky was turning from black to gray when the Melnibonéan fleet reached the open sea and turned its prows south towards the boiling sea and the southern continent beyond. The barbarian ships would not sail through the boiling sea. No mortal ship could do that, it was said, but would sail around it. Not that the barbarian ships would even reach the edges of the boiling sea, for the huge battle barges were fast-sailing vessels. The slaves who pulled the oars were full of a drug which increased their speed and their strength for a score or so of hours before it slew them. And now the sails billowed out, catching the breeze. Golden mountains skimming rapidly over the sea, these ships. Their method of construction was a secret lost even to the Melnibonéans, who had forgotten so much of their lore. It was easy to imagine how men of the young kingdoms hated Melniboné and its inventions, for it did seem that the battle barges belonged to an older, alien age, as they bore down upon the fleeing galleys now sighted on the horizon. The son of the PRA was in the lead of the rest of the fleet, and was priming its catapults well before any of its fellows had seen the enemy. Perspiring slaves gingerly manhandled the viscous stuff of the fireballs, getting them into the bronze cups of the catapults by means of long, spoon-ended tongs. It flickered in the pre-dawn gloom. Now slaves climbed the steps to the bridge and brought wine and food on platinum platters for the 3 dragon princes who had remained there since the pursuit had begun. Elric could not summon the strength to eat, but he seized a tall cup of yellow wine and drained it. The stuff was strong and revived him a trifle. He had another cup poured and drank that as swiftly as the other. He peered ahead. It was almost dawn. There was a line of purple light on the horizon. "At the first sign of the sun's disk," Elric said, "let loose the fireballs."
"I will give the order,"
said Mahkum Kolim, wiping his lips and putting down the meat bone on which he'd been chewing. He left the bridge. Elric heard his feet striking the steps heavily. All at once the albino felt surrounded by enemies. There had been something strange in Mahkum Kolim's manner during the argument with Prince Irkun. Elric tried to shake off such foolish thoughts, but the weariness, the self-doubt, the open mockery of his cousin, all succeeded in increasing the feeling that he was alone and without friends in the world. Even Simril and Divim Tvar were, finally, Melnibonéans, and could not understand the peculiar concerns which moved him and dictated his actions. Perhaps it would be wise to renounce everything Melnibonéan and wander the world as an anonymous soldier of fortune, serving whoever needed his aid. The dull red semicircle of the sun showed above the black line of the distant water. There came a series of booming sounds from the forward decks of the flagship as the catapults released their fiery shot. There was a whistling scream, fading away, and it seemed that a dozen meteors leapt through the sky, hurtling towards the 5 galleys which were now little more than 30 ship-lengths away. Elric saw 2 galleys flare, but the remaining 3 began to sail a zigzag course and avoided the fireballs which landed on the water and burned fitfully for a while before sinking, still burning, into the depths. More fireballs were prepared, and Elric heard Irkun shout from the other side of the bridge, ordering the slaves to greater exertions. Then the fleeing vessels changed their tactics, evidently realizing they could not save themselves for long, and, spreading out, sailed towards the son of the PRA, just as the other ships had done in the sea maze. It was not merely their courage that Elric admired, but their maneuvering skill and the speed at which they'd arrived at this logical, if hopeless, decision. The sun was behind the Southland ships as they turned. 3 brave silhouettes drew nearer to the Melnibonéan flagship as scarlet stained the sea, as if in anticipation of the bloodletting to come. Another volley of fireballs was flung from the flagship, and the leading galley tried to tack round and avoid it, but 2 of the fiery globes splattered directly on its deck, and soon the whole ship was alive with flame. Burning men leapt into the water. Burning men shot arrows at the flagship. Burning men slowly fell from their positions in the rigging. The burning men died, but the burning ship came on. Someone had lashed the steering arm and directed the galley at the son of PRA. It crashed into the golden side of the battle barge, and some of the fire splashed on the deck where the main catapults were in position. A cauldron containing the fire stuff caught, and immediately men were running from all quarters of the ship to try and douse the flame. Elric grinned as he saw what the barbarians had done. Perhaps that ship had deliberately allowed itself to be fired. Now the majority of the flagship's complement was engaged with putting out the blaze, while the Southland ships drew alongside, threw up their own grapples, and began to board. "Wear boarders!" Elric shouted long after he might have warned his crew. "Barbarians, attack!" He saw Irkun whirl round, see the situation, and rush down the steps from the bridge. "You stay there, my lord king," he flung at Elric as he disappeared. "You are plainly too weary to fight." And Elric summoned all that was left of his strength and stumbled after his cousin to help in the defense of the ship. The barbarians were not fighting for their lives. They knew those to be taken already. They were fighting for their pride. They wanted to take one Melnibonéan ship down with them, and that ship must be the flagship itself. It was hard to be contemptuous of such men. They knew that even if they took the flagship, the other ships of the Golden Fleet would soon overwhelm them. But the other ships were still some distance away. Many lives would be lost before they reached the flagship. On the lowest deck, Elric found himself facing a pair of tall barbarians, each armed with a curved blade and a small oblong shield. He lunged forward, but his armor seemed to drag at his limbs. His own shield and sword were so heavy he could barely lift them. Two swords struck at his helm almost simultaneously. He lunged back and caught a man in the arm, rammed the other with his shield. A curved blade clanged on his backplate, and he all but lost his footing. There was choking smoke everywhere and heat and the tumult of battle. Desperately, he swung about him and felt his broadsword bite deep into flesh. One of his opponents fell, gurgling with blood spouting from his mouth and nose. The other lunged. Elric stepped backwards, fell over the corpse of the man he had slain, and went down, his broadsword held out before him in one hand. And as the triumphant barbarian leapt forward to finish the albino, Elric caught him on the point of the broadsword, running him through. The dead man fell towards Elric, who did not feel the impact, for he had already fainted. Not for the first time had his deficient blood, no longer enriched by drugs, betrayed him. He tasted salt and thought at first it was blood, but it was seawater. A wave had risen over the deck and momentarily revived him. He struggled to crawl from under the dead man, and then he heard a voice he recognized. He twisted his head and looked up. Prince Irkun stood there. He was grinning. He was full of glee at Elric's plight. Black, oily smoke still drifted everywhere, but the sounds of the fight had died. Are we victorious, cousin?" "Aye. The barbarians are all dead now. We're about to sail for Imrir." Elric was relieved. He would begin to die soon if he could not get to his store of potions. His relief must have been evident, for Irkun laughed. "It is as well the battle did not last longer, my lord, or we should have been without our leader." "Help me up, cousin." Elric hated to ask Prince Irkun any favor, but he had no choice. He stretched out his empty hand. "I am fit enough to inspect the ship." Irkun came forward as if to take the hand, but then he hesitated, still grinning. "But my lord, I disagree. You will be dead by the time this ship turns eastward again." "Nonsense. Even without the drugs I can live for a considerable time, though movement is difficult." "Help me up, Irkun. I command you." "You cannot command me, Elric. I am emperor now, you see." "Be wary, cousin. I can overlook such treachery, but others will not. I shall be forced to—" Irkun swung his legs over Elric's body and went to the rail. Here were bolts which fixed one section of the rail in place when it was not used for the gangplank. Irkun slowly released the bolts and kicked the section of rail into the water. Now Elric's efforts to free himself became more desperate, but he could hardly move at all. Irkun, on the other hand, seemed possessed of unnatural strength. He bent and easily flung the corpse away from Elric. "Irkun, this is unwise of you." "I was never a cautious man, cousin, as well you know." Irkun placed a booted foot against Elric's ribs and began to shove. Elric slid towards the gap in the rail. He could see the black sea heaving below. "Farewell, Elric. Now a true Melnibonéan shall sit upon the ruby throne, and who knows, might even make Cymril his queen? It has not been unheard of." And Elric felt himself rolling, felt himself fall, felt himself strike the water, felt his armor pulling him below the surface. And Irkun's last words drummed in Elric's ears like the persistent booming of the waves against the sides of the golden battle barge. Book 2. Less certain of himself or his destiny than ever, the albino king must perforce bring his powers of sorcery into play, conscious that he has embarked upon a course of action by no means at one with his original conception of the way he wished to live his life. And now matters must be settled. He must begin to rule. He must become cruel. But even in this, he will find himself thwarted. Elric sank rapidly, desperately trying to keep the last of his breath in his body. He had no strength to swim, and the weight of the armor denied any hope of his rising to the surface and being sighted by Makun Kolim, or one of the others still loyal to him. The roaring in his ears gradually faded to a whisper, so that it sounded as if little voices were speaking to him, the voices of the water elementals with whom in his youth he had had a kind of friendship. And the pain in his lungs faded, the red mist cleared from his eyes, and he thought he saw the face of his father, Sadric, of Cymril, and fleetingly of Irkun. Stupid Irkun! For all that he prided himself that he was a Melnibonéan, he lacked the Melnibonéan subtlety. He was as brutal and direct as some of the young kingdom barbarians he so much despised. And now Elric began to feel almost grateful to his cousin. His life was over. The conflicts which tore his mind would no longer trouble him. His fears, his torments, his loves, and his hatreds all lay in the past, and only oblivion lay before him. As the last breath left his body, he gave himself wholly to the sea, to Strasha, lord of all the water elementals, once the comrade of the Melnibonéan folk. And as he did this, he remembered the old spell which his ancestors had used to summon Strasha. The spell came unbidden into his dying brain. "Waters of the sea, thou gave us birth, and were our milk and mother both. In days when skies were overcast, you who were first shall be the last. Sea rulers, fathers of our blood, thine aid is sought, thine aid is sought. Your salt is blood, our blood your salt, your blood the blood of man. Strasha, eternal king, eternal sea, thine aid is sought by me, for enemies of thine and mine seek to defeat our destiny and drain away our sea." Either the words had an old symbolic meaning, or they referred to some incident in Melnibonéan history which even Elric had not read about. The words meant very little to him, and yet they continued to repeat themselves as his body sank deeper and deeper into the green waters. Even when blackness overwhelmed him and his lungs filled with water, the words continued to whisper through the corridors of his brain. It was strange that he should be dead and still hear the incantation. It seemed a long while later that his eyes opened and revealed swirling water, and through it huge, indistinct figures gliding towards him. Death, it appeared, took a long time to come, and while he died, he dreamed. The leading figure had a turquoise beard and hair, pale green skin that seemed made of the sea itself, and when he spoke, a voice that was like a rushing tide. He smiled at Elric. "Strasha answers thy summons, mortal. Our destinies are bound together. How may I aid thee, and, in aiding thee, aid myself?" Elric's mouth was filled with water, and yet he still seemed capable of speech, thus proving he dreamed. He said, "King Strasha, the paintings in the Tower of Darbna, in the library when I was a boy, I saw them, King Strasha." The Sea King stretched out his sea-green hands. "Aye, you sent the summons. You need our aid. We honor our ancient pact with your folk." "No, I did not mean to summon you. The summons came unbidden to my dying mind. I am happy to drown, King Strasha." "That cannot be. If your mind summoned us, it means you wish to live. We will aid you." King Strasha's beard streamed in the tide, and his deep green eyes were gentle, almost tender, as they regarded the albino. Elric closed his own eyes again. "I dream. I deceive myself with fantasies of hope." He felt the water in his lungs, and he knew he no longer breathed. It stood to reason, therefore, that he was dead. "But if you were real, old friend, and you wished to aid me, you would return me to Melniboné, so that I might deal with the usurper Irkun, and save Cymrul before it is too late. That is my only regret. The torment which Cymrul will suffer if her brother becomes Emperor of Melniboné." "Is that all you ask of the water elementals?" King Strasha seemed almost disappointed. "I do not even ask that of you. I only voice what I would have wished, had this been reality, and I was speaking, which I know is impossible. Now I shall die." "That cannot be, Lord Elric, for our destinies are truly intertwined, and I know that it is not yet your destiny to perish. Therefore I will aid you, as you have suggested." Elric was surprised at the sharpness of detail of this fantasy. He said to himself, "What a cruel torment I subject myself to. Now I must set about admitting my death." "You cannot die. Not yet." Now it was as if the Sea King's gentle hands had picked him up and bore him through twisting corridors of a delicate coral-pink texture, slightly shadowed, no longer in water. And Elric felt the water vanish from his lungs and stomach, and he breathed. Could it be that he had actually been brought to the legendary plane of the elemental folk, a plane which intersected that of the earth in which they dwelled for the most part? In a huge circular cavern which shone with pink and blue mother-of-pearl, they came to rest at last. The Sea King laid Elric down upon the floor of the cavern, which seemed to be covered with fine white sand, which was yet not sand, for it yielded and then sprang back when he moved. When King Strasha moved, it was with a sound like the tide drawing itself back over shingle. The Sea King crossed the white sand, walking toward a large throne of milky jade. He seated himself upon this throne and placed his green head on his green fist, regarding Elric with puzzled yet compassionate eyes. Elric was still physically weak, but he could breathe. It was as if the seawater had filled him and then cleansed him when it was driven out. He felt clear-headed, and now he was much less sure that he dreamed. "I still find it hard to know why you saved me, King Strasha." "The rune. We heard it on this plane and we came. That is all." "Aye, but there is more to sorcery working than that. There are chants, symbols, rituals of all sorts. Previously, that has always been true." "Perhaps the rituals take the place of urgent need, of the kind which sent out your summons to us. Though you say you wish to die, it was evident that you did not really want to die, or the summoning would not have been so clear and have reached us so swiftly. Forget all this now. When you have rested, we shall do what you have requested of us." Painfully, Elric raised himself into a sitting position. "You spoke earlier of intertwined destinies. Do you then know something of my destiny?" "A little, I think. Our world grows old. Once the elementals were powerful on your plane, and the people of Melniboné all shared that power. But now our power wanes, as does yours. Something is changing. There are intimations that the lords of the higher worlds are again taking an interest in your world. Perhaps they fear that the folk of the young kingdoms have forgotten them. Perhaps the folk of the young kingdoms threaten to bring in a new age where gods and beings such as myself no longer shall have a place. I suspect there is a certain unease upon the plains of the higher worlds. You know no more? King Strasha raised his head and looked directly into Elric's eyes. There is no more I can tell you, son of my old friends, save that you would be happier if you gave yourself up entirely to your destiny when you understand it. Elric sighed. I think I know of what you speak, King Strasha. I shall try to follow your advice. And now that you have rested, it is time to return. The Sea King rose from his throne of milky jade and flowed towards Elric, lifting him up in strong green arms. We shall meet again before your life ends, Elric. I hope that I shall be able to aid you once more, and remember that our brothers of the air and of fire will try to aid you also. And remember the beasts. They too can be of service to you. There is no need to suspect their help. But beware of gods, Elric. Beware of the lords of the higher worlds, and remember that their aid and their gifts must always be paid for. These were the last words Elric heard the Sea King speak before they rushed again through the sinuous tunnels to this other plane, moving at such a speed that Elric could distinguish no details and, at times, did not know whether they remained in King Strasha's kingdom or had returned to the depths of his own world's sea. Strange clouds filled the sky, and the sun hung heavy and huge and red behind them, and the ocean was black as the golden galleys swept homeward before their battered flagship, the Son of the Piare, which moved slowly with dead slaves at her oars, and her tattered sails limp at their masts, and smoke-begrimed men on her decks, and a new emperor upon her war-wrecked bridge. The new emperor was the only jubilant man in the fleet, and he was jubilant indeed. It was his banner now, not Elric's, which took pride of place on the flagmast, for he had lost no time in proclaiming Elric slain, and himself ruler of Melniboné. To Irkun, the peculiar sky was an omen of change, of a return to the old ways and the old power of the Dragon Isle. When he issued orders, his voice was a veritable croon of pleasure, and Admiral Makum Kolim, who had ever been wary of Elric, but who now had to obey Irkun's orders, wondered if, perhaps, it would not have been preferable to have dealt with Irkun in the manner in which he suspected Irkun had dealt with Elric. Divam Tavar leaned on the rail of his own ship, Terhali's particular satisfaction, and he also paid attention to the sky, though he saw omens of doom, for he mourned for Elric, and considered how he might take vengeance on Prince Irkun, should it emerge that Irkun had murdered his cousin for possession of the Ruby Throne. Melniboné appeared on the horizon, a brooding silhouette of crags, a dark monster squatting in the sea, calling her own back to the heated pleasures of her womb, the dreaming city of Imrir. The great cliffs loomed, the central gate to the sea maze open. Water slapped and gasped as the golden prows disturbed it, and the golden ships were swallowed into the murky dankness of the tunnels, where bits of wreckage still floated from the previous night's encounter, where white, bloated corpses could still be seen when the brand light touched them. The prows nosed arrogantly through the remains of their prey, but there was no joy aboard the golden battle barges, for they brought news of their old emperor's death in battle. Irkun had told them what had happened. Next night, and for 7 nights in all, the wild dance of Melniboné would fill the streets, Potions and petty spells would ensure that no one slept, for sleep was forbidden to any Melnibonéan, old or young, while a dead emperor was mourned. Naked, the dragon princes would prowl the city, taking any young woman they found and filling her with their seed, for it was traditional that if an emperor died, then the nobles of Melniboné must create as many children of aristocratic blood as was possible. Music slaves would howl from the top of every tower. Other slaves would be slain, and some eaten. It was a dreadful dance, the dance of misery, and it took as many lives as it created. A tower would be pulled down, and a new one erected during those 7 days, and the tower would be called for Elric VIII, the albino emperor, slain upon the sea, defending Melniboné against the Southland pirates. Slain upon the sea, and his body taken by the waves. That was not a good portent, for it meant that Elric had gone to serve Piare, the tentacled whisperer of impossible secrets, the Chaos Lord, who commanded the Chaos Fleet, dead ships, dead sailors, forever in his thrall, and it was not fitting that such a fate should befall one of the royal line of Melniboné. Ah, but the mourning would be long, thought Divem Tavar. He had loved Elric, for all that he had sometimes disapproved of his methods of ruling the Dragon Isle. Secretly, he would go to the dragon caves that night and spend the period of mourning with the sleeping dragons who, now that Elric was dead, were all that he had left to love. And Divem Tavar then thought of Cimmeril, awaiting Elric's return. The ships began to emerge into the half-light of the evening. Torches and braziers already burned on the quays of Imrir, which were deserted save for a small group of figures who stood around a chariot which had been driven out to the end of the central mole. A cold wind blew. Divem Tavar knew that it was the Princess Cimmeril who waited with her guards for the fleet. Though the flagship was the last to pass through the maze, the rest of the ships had to wait until it could be towed into position and dock first. If this had not been the required tradition, Divem Tavar would have left his ship and gone to speak to Cimmeril, escort her from the quay, and tell her what he knew of the circumstances of Elric's death. But it was impossible. Even before Terhali's particular satisfaction had dropped anchor, the main gangplank of the Son of the Piare had been lowered, and the Emperor Yrkun, all swaggering pride, had stepped down it, his arms raised in triumphant salute to his sister, who could be seen even now, searching the decks of the ships for a sign of her beloved albino. Suddenly Cimmeril knew that Elric was dead, and she suspected that Yrkun had in some way been responsible for Elric's death. Either Yrkun had allowed Elric to be borne down by a group of Southland reavers, or else he had managed to slay Elric himself. She knew her brother, and she recognized his expression. He was pleased with himself, as he always had been when successful in some form of treachery or another. Anger flashed in her tear-filled eyes, and she threw back her head and shouted at the shifting, ominous sky, "Oh, Yrkun has destroyed him!" Her guards were startled. The captain spoke solicitously. "Madam?" "He is dead, and my brother slew him. Take Prince Yrkun, Captain. Kill Prince Yrkun, Captain." Unhappily, the captain put his right hand on the hilt of his sword. A young warrior, more impetuous, drew his blade, murmuring, "I will slay him, princess, if that is your desire." The young warrior loved Cimmeril with considerable and unthinking intensity. The captain offered the warrior a cautionary glance, but the warrior was blind to it. Now 2 others slid swords from scabbards as Yrkun, a red cloak wound about him, his dragon crest catching the light from the brands guttering in the wind, stalked forward and cried, "Yrkun is emperor now." "No!" shrieked his sister. "Elric! Elric, where are you?" "Serving his new master, Piare of Chaos. His dead hands pull at the sweep of a chaos ship, sister. His dead eyes see nothing at all. His dead ears hear only the crack of Piare's whips. And his dead flesh cringes, feeling naught but that unearthly scourge. Elric sank in his armor to the bottom of the sea.
"Murderer! Traitor!"
Cymril began to sob. The captain, who was a practical man, said to his warriors in a low voice, "Sheath your weapons and salute your new emperor." Only the young guardsman who loved Cymril disobeyed.
"But he slew the emperor. My lady Cymril said so."
"What of it? He is emperor now. Kneel, or you'll be dead within the minute." The young warrior gave a wild shout and leapt towards Irkun, who stepped back, trying to free his arms from the folds of his cloak. He had not expected this. But it was the captain who leapt forward, his own sword drawn, and hacked down the youngster so that he gasped, half-turned, and then fell at Irkun's feet. This demonstration of the captain's was confirmation of his real power, and Irkun almost smirked with satisfaction as he looked down at the corpse. The captain fell to one knee, the bloody sword still in his hand. "My emperor."
"You show a proper loyalty, Captain."
"My loyalty is to the Ruby Throne."
"Quite so."
Cymril shook with grief and rage, but her rage was impotent. She knew now that she had no friends. Leering, the Emperor Irkun presented himself before her. He reached out his hand and caressed her neck, her cheek, her mouth. He let his hand fall so that it grazed her breast.
"Sister, thou art mine entirely now."
And Cymril was the second to fall at his feet, for she had fainted.
"Pick her up. Take her back to her own tower, and there be sure she remains. 2 guards will be with her at all times, even in her most private moments. They must observe her, for she may plan treachery against the Ruby Throne."
The captain bowed and signed to his men to obey the emperor.
"Aye, my lord. It shall be done."
Irkun looked back at the corpse of the young warrior.
"And feed that to her slaves tonight, so that he can continue serving her."
He smiled. The captain smiled too, appreciating the joke. He felt it was good to have a proper emperor in Melniboné again. An emperor who knew how to behave, who knew how to treat his enemies, and who accepted unswerving loyalty as his right. The captain fancied that fine martial times lay ahead for Melniboné. The golden battle barges and the warriors of Imrir could go a-spoiling again, and instill in the barbarians of the young kingdoms a sweet and satisfactory sense of fear. Already in his mind the captain helped himself to the treasures of Lormir, Argamiliar, and Picarade, of Ilmiora and Jadmar. He might even be made governor, say, of the Isle of the Purple Towns. What luxuries of torment would he bring to those upstart sea lords, particularly Count Smiorgan Baldhead, who was even now beginning to try to make the Isle a rival to Melniboné as a trading port. As he escorted the limp body of Princess Cymril back to her tower, the captain looked on that body and felt the swellings of lust within him. Irkun would reward his loyalty, there was no doubt of that. Despite the cold wind, the captain began to sweat in anticipation. He himself would guard the Princess Cymril. He would relish it. Marching at the head of his army, Irkun strutted for the Tower of Darupna, the Tower of Emperors and the Ruby Throne within. He preferred to ignore the litter which had been brought for him and to go on foot, so that he might savor every small moment of his triumph. He approached the tower, tall among its fellows at the very center of Imrir, as he might approach a beloved woman. He approached it with a sense of delicacy and without haste, for he knew that it was his. He looked about him. His army marched behind him. Makum Kolim and Divim Tavar led the army. People lined the twisting streets and bowed low to him. Slaves prostrated themselves. Even the beasts of burden were made to kneel as he strode by. Irkun could almost taste the power, as one might taste a luscious fruit. He drew deep breaths of air. Even the air was his. All Imrir was his. All Melniboné. Soon All the world would be his, and he would squander it all. How he would squander it! Such a grand terror would he bring back to the earth, such a munificence of fear. In ecstasy, almost blindly, did the Emperor Irkun enter the tower. He hesitated at the great doors of the throne room. He signed for the doors to be opened, and as they opened he deliberately took in the scene tiny bit by tiny bit. The walls, the banners, the trophies, the galleries, all were his. The throne room was empty now, but soon he would fill it with color and celebration and true Melnibonean entertainment. It had been too long since blood had sweetened the air of this hall. Now he let his eyes linger upon the steps leading up to the ruby throne itself, but before he looked at the throne he heard Divim Tavar gasp behind him, and his gaze went suddenly to the ruby throne, and his jaw slackened at what he saw. His eyes widened in incredulity. "An illusion!" "An apparition," said Divim Tavar with some satisfaction. "Heresy!" cried Emperor Irkun, staggering forward, finger pointing at the robed and cowled figure which sat so still upon the ruby throne. "Mine! Mine!" The figure made no reply. "Mine! Begone! The throne belongs to Irkun. Irkun is emperor now. What are you? Why would you thwart me thus?" The cowl fell back, and a bone-white face was revealed, surrounded by flowing, milk-white hair. Crimson eyes looked coolly down at the shrieking, stumbling thing which came towards them. "You are dead, Elric! I know that you are dead!" The apparition made no reply, but a thin smile touched the white lips. "You could not have survived! You drowned! You cannot come back! Piare owns your soul!" "There are others who rule in the sea," said the figure on the ruby throne. "Why did you slay me, cousin?" Irkun's guile had deserted him, making way for terror and confusion. "Because it is my right to rule! Because you are not strong enough, nor cruel enough, nor humorous enough!" "Is this not a good joke, cousin?" "Begone! Begone! Begone! I shall not be ousted by a spectre! A dead emperor cannot rule Melniboné!" "We shall see," said Elric, signing to Divim Tavar and his soldiers. "Now, indeed, I shall rule as you would have had me rule, cousin." Elric watched as Divim Tavar's soldiers surrounded the would-be usurper and seized his arms, relieving him of his weapons. Irkun panted like a captured wolf. He glared around him as if hoping to find support from the assembled warriors, but they stared back at him, either neutrally or with open contempt. "And you, Prince Irkun, will be the first to benefit from this new rule of mine. Are you pleased?" Irkun lowered his head. He was trembling now. Elric laughed. "Speak up, cousin." "May Arioch and all the dukes of hell torment you for eternity!" Irkun flung back his head, his wild eyes rolling, his lips curling. "Arioch! Arioch, curse this feeble albino! Arioch, destroy him or see Melniboné fall!" Elric continued to laugh. "Arioch does not hear you. Chaos is weak upon the earth now. It needs a greater sorcery than yours to bring the Chaos Lords back to aid you, as they aided our ancestors. And now, Irkun, tell me, where is the Lady Cymril?" But Irkun had lapsed again into a sullen silence. "She is at her own tower, my emperor," said Makum Kolim. "A creature of Irkun's took her there," said Divim Tavar. "The captain of Cymril's own guard. He slew a warrior who tried to defend his mistress against Irkun. It could be that Princess Cymril is in danger, my lord." "Then go quickly to the tower, take a force of men. Bring both Cymril and the captain of her guard to me." "And Irkun, my lord?" "Let him remain here until his sister returns." Divim Tavar bowed, and selecting a body of warriors, left the throne room. All noticed that Divim Tavar's step was lighter, and his expression less grim than when he'd first approached the throne room at Prince Irkun's back. Irkun straightened his head and looked about the court. For a moment he seemed like a pathetic and bewildered child. All the lines of hate and anger had disappeared, and Elric felt sympathy for his cousin growing again within him. But this time, Elric quelled the feeling. "Be grateful, cousin, that for a few hours you were totally powerful, that you enjoyed domination over all the folk of Melniboné," Irkun said in a small, puzzled voice.
"How did you escape? You had no time for making a sorcery, no strength for it. You could barely move your limbs, and your armor must have dragged you deep to the bottom of the sea so that you should have drowned. It is unfair, Elric. You should have drowned."
Elric shrugged. "I have friends in the sea. They recognize my royal blood and my right to rule, if you do not." Irkun tried to disguise the astonishment he felt. Evidently his respect for Elric had increased, as had his hatred for the albino emperor.
"Friends."
"Aye," said Elric, with a thin grin.
I thought, too, you had vowed not to use your powers of sorcery."
"But you thought that a vow which was unbefitting for a Melnibonéan monarch to make, did you not? Well, I agree with you. You see, Irkun, you have won a victory after all." Irkun stared narrowly at Elric, as if trying to divine a secret meaning behind Elric's words.
"You will bring back the Chaos Lords?"
"No sorcerer, however powerful, can summon the Chaos Lords, or for that matter the Lords of Law, if they do not wish to be summoned. That you know. You must know it, Irkun. Have you not yourself tried? And Ariach did not come, did he? Did he bring you the gift you sought? The gift of the 2 black swords?"
"You know that?"
"I did not. I guessed. Now I know." Irkun tried to speak, but his voice would not form words, so angry was he. Instead, a strangled growl escaped his throat, and for a few moments he struggled in the grip of his guards. Divim Tavar returned with Cimmerl. The girl was pale, but she was smiling. She ran into the throne room. "Elric!" "Cimmerl, are you harmed?" Cimmerl glanced at the crestfallen captain of her guard who'd been brought with her. A look of disgust crossed her fine face. Then she shook her head. "No, I am not harmed." The captain of Cimmerl's guard was shaking with terror. He looked pleadingly at Irkun, as if hoping that his fellow prisoner could help him, but Irkun continued to stare at the floor. "Have that one brought closer." Elric pointed at the captain of the guard. The man was dragged to the foot of the steps leading to the ruby throne. He moaned. "What a petty traitor you are," said Elric. "At least Irkun had the courage to attempt to slay me, and his ambitions were high. Your ambition was merely to become one of his pet curs. So you betrayed your mistress and slew one of your own men. What is your name?" The man had difficulty speaking, but at last he murmured, "It is Valharic, my name. What could I do? I serve the ruby throne, whoever sits upon it." "So, the traitor claims that loyalty motivated him. I think not." "It was, my lord, it was. Slay me swiftly. Do not punish me more." Elric's impulse was to heed the man's request, but he looked at Irkun and then remembered the expression on Cimmerl's face when she looked at the guard. He knew that he must make a point now, while making an example of Captain Valharic, so he shook his head. "No, I will punish you more. Tonight you will die here according to the traditions of Melniboné, while my nobles feast to celebrate this new era of my rule." Valharic began to sob. Then he stopped himself and got slowly to his feet, a Melnibonéan again. He bowed low and stepped backward, giving himself into the grip of his guards. "I must consider a way in which your fate may be shared with the one you wish to serve. How did you slay the young warrior who sought to obey Cimmerl?" "With my sword.
I cut him down. It was a clean stroke, but one.
And what became of the corpse?
Prince Irkun told me to feed it to Princess Cymral's slaves.
I understand. Very well. Prince Irkun, you may join us at the feast tonight, while Captain Valharic entertains us with his dying. Irkun's face was almost as pale as Elric's.
What do you mean?
The little pieces of Captain Valharic's flesh, which our Dr. Jest will carve from his limbs, will be the meat on which you feast. You may give instructions as to how you wish the captain's flesh prepared. We should not expect you to eat it raw, cousin. Even Divim Tavar looked astonished at Elric's decision. Certainly it was in the spirit of Melnibone, and a clever irony improving on Prince Irkun's own idea, but it was unlike Elric, or at least it was unlike the Elric he had known up until a day earlier. As he heard his fate, Captain Valharic gave a great scream of terror and glared at Prince Irkun as if the would-be usurper were already tasting his flesh. Irkun tried to turn away, his shoulders shaking. And that will be the beginning of it. The feast will start at midnight. Until that time, confine Irkun to his own tower. After Prince Irkun and Captain Valharic had been led away, Divim Tavar and Princess Cymral came and stood beside Elric, who had sunk back in his great throne and was staring bitterly into the middle distance.
That was a clever cruelty,
Divim Tavar said. Cymral said, It is what they both deserve. Aye, it is what my father would have done. It is what Irkun would have done had our positions been reversed. I but follow the traditions. I no longer pretend that I am my own man. Here I shall stay until I die, trapped upon the ruby throne, serving the ruby throne as Valharic claimed to serve it. Could you not kill them both quickly? You know that I do not plead for my brother because he is my brother. I hate him, most of all, but it might destroy you, Elric, to follow through with your plan. What if it does? Let me be destroyed. Let me merely become an unthinking extension of my ancestors, the puppet of ghosts and memories, dancing to strings which extend back through time for 10,000 years.
Perhaps if you slept,
Divim Tavar suggested. I shall not sleep, I feel, for many nights after this. But your brother is not going to die, Cymral. After his punishment, after he has eaten the flesh of Captain Valharic, I intend to send him into exile. He will go alone into the young kingdoms, and he will not be allowed to take his grimoires with him. He must make his way as best he can in the lands of the barbarian. That is not too severe a punishment, I think. It is too lenient. You would be best advised to slay him. Send soldiers now. Give him no time to consider counterplots. I do not fear his counterplots. Elric rose wearily. Now I should like it if you would both leave me until an hour or so before the feasting begins. I must think. I will return to my tower and prepare myself for tonight, said Cymral. She kissed Elric lightly upon his pale forehead. He looked up, filled with love and tenderness for her. He reached out and touched her hair and cheek. Remember that I love you, Elric, she said.
I will see that you are safely escorted homeward,
Divim Tavar said to her.
And you must choose a new commander for your guard. Can I assist in that?
I should be grateful, Divim Tavar. They left Elric still upon the ruby throne, still staring into space. The hand that he lifted from time to time to his pale head shook a little, and now the torment showed in his strange crimson eyes. Later he rose up from the ruby throne and walked slowly, head bowed, to his own apartments, followed by his guards. He hesitated at the door which led onto the steps, going up to the library. Instinctively he sought the consolation and forgetfulness of a certain kind of knowledge, but at that moment he suddenly hated his scrolls and his books. He blamed them for his ridiculous concerns regarding morality and justice. He blamed them for the feelings of guilt and despair which now filled him as a result of his decision to behave as a Melnibonéan monarch was expected to behave. So he passed the door to the library and went on to his apartments, but even his apartments displeased him now. They were austere. They were not furnished according to the luxurious taste of all Melnibonéans, save for his father, with their delight in lush mixtures of color and bizarre design. He would have them changed as soon as possible. He would give himself up to those ghosts who ruled him. For some time he stalked from room to room, trying to push back that part of him which demanded he be merciful to Valharic and to Irkun. At very least to slay them and be done with it, or, better, to send them both into exile. But it was impossible to reverse his decision now. At last he lowered himself to a couch which rested beside a window looking out over the whole of the city. The sky was still full of turbulent cloud, but now the moon shone through, like the yellow eye of an unhealthy beast. It seemed to stare with a certain triumphant irony at him, as if relishing the defeat of his conscience. Elric sank his head into his arms. Later, the servants came to tell him that the courtiers were assembling for the celebration feast. He allowed them to dress him in his yellow robes of state and to place the dragon crown upon his head, and then he returned to the throne room to be greeted by a mighty cheer, more wholehearted than any he had ever received before. He acknowledged the greeting and then seated himself in the ruby throne, looking out over the banqueting tables which now filled the hall. A table was brought and set before him, and 2 extra seats were brought, for Divim Tavar and Cymril would sit beside him. But Divim Tavar and Cymril were not yet here, and neither had the renegade Valharic been brought. And where was Irkun? They should even now be at the center of the hall, Valharic in chains and Irkun seated beneath him. Dr. Jest was there, heating his brazier on which rested his cooking pans, testing and sharpening his knives. The hall was filled with excited talk as the court waited to be entertained. Already the food was being brought in, though no one might eat until the Emperor ate first. Elric signed to the commander of his own guard. "Has the Princess Cymril or Lord Divim Tavar arrived at the tower yet?"
"No, my lord."
Cymril was rarely late, and Divim Tavar never. Elric frowned. Perhaps they did not relish the entertainment. "And what of the prisoners?"
"They have been sent for, my lord."
Dr. Jest looked up expectantly, his thin body tensed in anticipation. And then Elric heard a sound above the din of the conversation, a groaning sound which seemed to come from all around the tower. He bent his head and listened closely. Others were hearing it now. They stopped talking and also listened intently. Soon the whole hall was in silence, and the groaning increased. Then, all at once, the doors of the throne room burst open, and there was Divim Tavar, gasping and bloody, his clothes slashed and his flesh gashed. And following him in came a mist, a swirling mist of dark purples and unpleasant blues, and it was this mist that groaned. Elric sprang from his throne and knocked the table aside. He leapt down the steps towards his friend. The groaning mist began to creep further into the throne room, as if reaching out for Divim Tavar. Elric took his friends in his arms. "Divim Tavar, what is this sorcery?" Divim's face was full of horror, and his lips seemed frozen, until at last he said, "It is Irkun's sorcery. He conjured the groaning mist to aid him in his escape. I tried to follow him from the city, but the mist engulfed me and I lost my senses. I went to his tower to bring him and his accessory here, but the sorcery had already been accomplished." "Cymril, where is she?" "He took her, Elric. She is with him. Valharic is with him, and so are 100 warriors who remain secretly loyal to him." "Then we must pursue him. We shall soon capture him." "You can do nothing against the groaning mist. Ah, it comes!" And sure enough, The mist was beginning to surround them. Elric tried to disperse it by waving his arms, but then it had gathered thickly around him, and its melancholy groaning filled its ears. Its hideous colors blinded his eyes. He tried to rush through it, but it remained with him. And now he thought he heard words amongst the groans.
Elric is weak. Elric is foolish. Elric must die.
"Stop this!" he cried. He bumped into another body and fell to his knees. He began to crawl, desperately trying to pierce. Now faces formed in the mist, frightful faces, more terrifying than any he'd ever seen, even in his worst nightmares. "Cymrul!" he cried. "Cymrul!" And one of the faces became the face of Cymrul. A Cymrul who leered at him and mocked him, and whose face slowly aged until he saw a filthy crone, and ultimately a skull on which the flesh rotted. He closed his eyes, but the image remained.
"Cymrul,"
whispered the voices.
"Cymrul."
And Elric grew weaker as he became more desperate. He cried out for Divan Tavar, but heard only a mocking echo of the name, as he'd heard Cymrul's. He shut his lips and he shut his eyes, and, still crawling, tried to free himself from the groaning mist. But hours seemed to pass before the groans became whines and the bands of sound, and he tried to rise, opening his eyes to see the mist fading. But then his legs buckled, and he fell down against the first step which led to the ruby throne. Again he had ignored Cymrul's advice concerning her brother, and again she was in danger. Elric's last thought was a simple one. "I am not fit to live."